First of all, on behalf of the Fidelity and CardKnox family, great to welcome everyone to this webinar about fraud. You know, I always like to tell my favorite joke about fraud. I went to a psychic, but I knew she was a fraud the minute she cashed the check. That's a joke because, okay, as my son likes to say about jokes, jokes are like frogs. If you have to dissect them, they're dead. So I can tell from Shoshana's face, I didn't do very well with that one. But thanks for joining us. So I'm VP of Sales here at CardKnox, leading omni-channel payment gateway. We provide businesses in a wide variety of industries with advanced payment processing technology for securely securely process payments in store and in line. Sorry, I always like to preface, like I did to Shoshana before. I got my producers, my executive producers in my ear, like Anderson Cooper, and so I have to go between the script and the Zoom chat. So we're still getting our kinks out, working this whole webinar thing out. So we're very excited about our guest, and just to give some background. Over the last several months, e-commerce and other online payment processing solutions have exploded in popularity in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, research shows that e-commerce spending has grown by, ready for this, 56% since the end of February, which is absolutely incredible, 56%. So basically, e-commerce is growing at an unprecedented pace. So here at CardKnox, we've seen this dramatic shift take place among many of our own merchants. And we've been working very closely with software developers and merchants who are in need of online processing solutions to maintain their revenue streams. So as merchants ramp up their focus on e-commerce, though, it's important they stay vigilant against the threat of e-commerce fraud and chargebacks. Okay? And to help merchants during this challenging time, we're joined today by a very special guest, and all the way out of the great city of New York, Shoshana Posner, who's the Director of Business Development at a company called, very counterintuitive, NoFraud, okay? She has a ton of knowledge on e-commerce fraud, at least that's what she tells us, and how it can be prevented. And we're excited to open up this conversation with her. If you have any questions during the webinar, like I mentioned to all those who were who joined the chat prior, okay, and they were able to watch as we were getting everything live. So you can feel free to submit them in two places, either in the chat box or in the Q&A, okay? And we'll be happy to save some time at the end for Q&A, or throughout the webinar, we'll definitely try to address questions as they come along. So with that, I'll turn it over to Shoshana.
Thanks, Mark. Hey, I'm Shoshana. I'm the Director of Business Development at NoFraud. NoFraud's an online fraud prevention company. We were founded in 2015, and our customers are e-commerce merchants. What we do for our customers is we screen their transactions for fraud. We will advise our customers whether or not the transaction that was just processed on their site is legitimate or if it's fraudulent. Now, we keep up to date with the latest fraud trends. As you can imagine, fraud keeps evolving and emerging as the fraudsters come up with new ways to rip off merchants. So our customers are able to remain safe by all the latest knowledge that we've learned. And that way, they don't have to fall victim to the potential huge losses that can occur with fraud chargebacks. We're also really confident in what we do. So what we offer to our clients is a chargeback guarantee. So customers can know that if NoFraud said it's safe to ship, they can ship their orders without worry and fear of fraud.
Shoshana, that's incredible. So essentially, just to encapsulate what NoFraud is, you're basically providing assurances and security for merchants in an e-commerce situation, which is something that I think as merchants shift from the brick and mortar, we've done a series of webinars. The first one since this COVID-19 crisis started was about shifting from brick and mortar to to e-commerce. And basically what you're saying is you're providing them with that sense of security, essentially, guaranteeing transactions in the event of fraud, which is really a unique platform and service, and it's very exciting. So in general, fraud and chargebacks have always been a challenge for e-commerce merchants. I think everyone who orders online, which is pretty much everyone, knows that. So would you say that it's become a bigger issue now during the COVID-19 pandemic, or things are about the same?
So it's interesting because we've definitely seen a huge shift in trends. Of course, there's the increased volume as brick and mortar stores are shut. The only option really has been online. So aside from the increased volume, we've seen a lot of the same classic patterns, but over time, as the weeks wore on, we saw a big increase in fraud attempts. So that's definitely been an interesting development. And one thing that we also noticed recently is a big uptick in what's so-called friendly fraud or chargeback abuse. Friendly fraud is a misnomer. There's nothing friendly about friendly fraud, but what it really is buyer's remorse packaged as fraud. People have been bored, they've been shopping online, they got their product, they love it, but then a couple weeks later, the credit card bill comes through and they realize they don't have enough money to pay for their product that they purchased online. So what they'll do is they'll submit a chargeback and say, oh, this is fraud, I didn't purchase it. Really, they were definitely the ones that purchased it, they just can't cover the charges online. So we've seen quite a big uptick in those types of chargebacks, which is not, it's not necessarily fraud because the cardholder did make the chargeback, but it's still a really big headache that a merchant has to deal with.
Gotcha. Yeah, we've definitely seen here at CardKnox, chargeback issues being more rampant. I was part of an online conference, the ETA Transact, basically the the largest payment association here in the U.S. And one of the things that they talked about was the issue of chargebacks. There's no question about it. And just before I go further, I just want to do a quick shout out to my friend Joe, as well as my buddy Levy. Okay, Levy, we're looking forward to those questions that you have for us as usual. A lot of merchants now are navigating. Shoshana, sorry for going off script a little bit, but when I see Joe and I see Levy, it just gets me excited. Oh, there we go, Levy. So when I see Joe and Levy, it just lights up my day. All right, so a lot of merchants now, they're navigating the shift from in-store sales to online sales. These merchants are much more familiar with what in-store fraud looks like and how it can be prevented. Okay, so in-store fraud is very simple, right? One of the things CardKnox, was first to market was with an EMV solution. EMV chip card technology has been very effective in mitigating counterfeit fraud in store. Okay. But now that so many merchants are processing so much online, and it's not, and we use the term merchants internally, but it's not just merchants. We work with a variety of churches, which, they were going from tithing in person to tithing online. And it's just, the dramatic shift has been absolutely incredible. So I want to talk about the unique challenges of the e-commerce or card not present checkout flow. Are e-commerce transactions more vulnerable to fraud than if I was making an in-store transaction?
So absolutely, and I think this is something that a lot of merchants find out the hard way. So companies that have a physical presence, they know as long as the EMV chip is put into the terminal, they're safe from fraud. Once they start on an online business, a lot of them simply don't know that it's the merchant's responsibility to ensure that the transaction was made by the cardholder. So companies that are starting online, especially those that just started during the COVID pandemic, there's so much that they have to do in such a short amount of time. A lot of them just simply haven't thought of their fraud liability, and they get really surprised when the chargebacks start rolling in and they say, oh, this is even a thing? I didn't know there was a thing. Help, what do I do? And on top of that, fraud is complex and it comes in many, many forms. So online businesses have to really be a fraud expert if they're doing it alone on knowing what are the indicators. How do I know that this order that has different billing and shipping is safe to ship, or if it's a fraudster that's trying to ship goods to their home? So for a first-time online vendor, they could be completely unprepared to even know what to look out for. And then on top of that, some companies that had a very light online presence and a larger presence in store, they've shifted all their marketing to their online business. And a lot of small companies will typically do their review, fraud review in person, in-house, which was fine if they were doing a couple of orders a day. But once the deluge comes, it's hundreds of orders a day. They're simply not prepared to be able to look at every single order and confirm that it's not fraudulent. So just with the volume swings, a lot of online businesses were just not ready.
Wow. So that's really interesting, because there's no question about it, that volume. I mean, I mentioned before 56%, but obviously it's going to vary industry by industry. I mean, you have restaurants that are completely shut down, but their delivery is actually their primary business. There's so many businesses that have literally overnight gone from brick and mortar to online, to e-commerce. So what ties, I think, many of these fraud methods together is that they rely on the interception of sensitive data. And while today we're focused on preventing fraudulent orders from going through, I do want to bring up the importance of protecting your customers' payment data so that it can't be used for fraudulent purposes. One of the best ways you can do this is by maintaining PCI compliance and utilizing robust data encryption technology. CardNox actually has its own tokenization technology. Just to define tokenization, a token basically is similar to what you'd use at an amusement park. Remember the good old days pre-COVID-19 when we used to actually go to amusement parks and use tokens, right? So essentially what it is converting a 15 or 16 digit credit card number into a 32 digit alphanumeric code. So that's the concept of tokenization. And CardNox offers this unique tokenization, storing payment card data in a secure token form to prevent it from being intercepted by hackers and allowing it to be reused for future purposes. Maintaining this dual focus on preventing fraudulent transactions from going through, as well as protecting the customer's card data from data breaches, is of the essence for online merchants. And we've all seen our fair share of data breaches, both before COVID-19 as well as post-COVID-19. So there's no question about it that they're definitely real. Now I'd like to discuss fraud liability, which is probably the key word here, liability for e-commerce merchants. So we touched upon EMV technology before, which is what we use in the retail space in the card-present environment. Just to give the example, I buy a pizza from a restaurant, I pay with my credit card, I'm using a physical card with an EMV chip, that little chip, right? That's a card-present transaction, okay? Versus I'm buying that same pizza and I'm ordering it from the restaurant and it's being sent to my house via delivery, okay? Different thing, but similar type of thing is that you do not have that EMV technology, okay? That was a new thing that we had in 2015. So one of the biggest benefits of EMV technology for merchants, besides for the fact that it reduces fraud and chargebacks, is that once it's fully implemented in store, merchants are no longer liable for the cost of a fraudulent EMV transaction. Instead, the issuing bank is. And I know people were very excited. One of the things I saw was the gratification that people had in 2015 as we helped bring EMV to market. There was so much gratification among merchants about the fact that they were now protected. They were now covered. In the e-commerce world, that doesn't exist, or does it? How does liability come into play for fraudulent e-commerce transactions? And Shoshana, what can you do to assist?
Sure. So it's, when you mention that your businesses that sell in brick and mortar, were gratified, it's really, the online businesses then were just grumbling a lot more because we saw a huge shift in the way fraud, the way, where fraud occurs. So it really shifted online, and there was a big spike in fraud in the online sphere. And that's where companies like NoFraud realized that there is an opportunity to help online businesses stop fraud from occurring on their sites. So essentially, we help them play defense and ensure that they are not going to be liable for fraud chargebacks, because there will be no fraud chargebacks, because we'll be screening their transactions and helping them stop those online, those fraudulent transactions. And while I'd love to say, our customers will never get a fraud chargeback, it does occur from time to time, and that's where the service that we offer, which is the chargeback guarantee, comes in. So if there's a chargeback that occurred on a transaction that NoFraud said is safe to ship, we'll make the customer whole. So our online businesses and our customers can enjoy, doing business without the fear and the fraud liability.
Understood. So that's really a huge value proposition. Would you say that there's certain types of fraud that are more costly for e-commerce merchants? In other words, is it easier to win back losses on certain types of fraud as opposed to others?
So absolutely. So I previously mentioned something about friendly fraud. So there are different types of chargebacks that a merchant can receive. So there's the fraud or unauthorized chargebacks, and those are very, very difficult to win, and it's almost impossible to win those, because the credit card companies will essentially say, it was your responsibility to make sure that this card was not used on your site, and you failed. You processed the order, you shipped the goods to the fraudster, and you're out the money, not us, or not the cardholder. However, when it comes to friendly fraud, you have a bigger chance of winning. So the credit card companies essentially
remind us again what friendly fraud is for those who may have joined us later, or just for those of us who need a refresher.
Sure. So friendly fraud is really a misnomer. There's nothing friendly about friendly fraud. It's where the cardholder simply doesn't want to pay for their goods and are claiming fraud, but it actually isn't fraud. So, I was really bored during, the pandemic. I bought myself a $300 purse. I loved it. It looked so pretty. Then I get the credit card bill and I say, oh, I don't have the $300 to cover this credit card bill. So I tried to hide behind the very generous policies that the credit card companies offer. In 5 clicks, I've issued a chargeback. The money goes right back into my account. So merchants, there's no way to stop friendly fraud from occurring because you can't control what the consumers will do, like what the legitimate consumers will do. However, you can fight it and provide to the credit card companies all the proof that you have that this transaction is in fact a legitimate transaction. So fighting the friendly fraud chargebacks, you'll generally have a pretty high win rate.
Wow, that's awesome. So now that we have a better understanding of what e-commerce fraud looks like, let's delve into the different options for preventing e-commerce fraud. I know smaller merchants often resort to manually screening orders. How is this done? And for larger merchants who don't have the capacity to screen all their orders, what are their options? What do they do?
Sure. So a lot of small companies that we work with, or when they were small, they used to do in short, a lot of Googling. It's a lot of manual and tedious work where they would say, okay, the billing address is what the credit company has on file. However, the shipping address is different. How can I connect the person that lives at the billing to the person that is at the shipping address? They'll look to see who lives at the shipping address, Google the phone number, the email, till they feel confident that this order is safe to ship. So that's generally what's done. Some companies
so it sounds
will
like a full-time job. Basically, Google's a full-time job.
Yeah, and you also have to know what you're doing because the fraudsters are smart and they will exploit any vulnerability that a company has in their defenses. Some companies get very...
fraudsters have definitely gotten smarter and they're not as dumb as I look, right?
They are very bright. We've seen some schemes. I mean, there was a wave of fraud in the summer where the fraudsters were able to exploit a vulnerability in Capital One. What they did was they hired what we call fraud mules, which are essentially people that will shop on behalf of the fraudsters. They reached out, and we heard several variations of this. Either they reached out via Russian newspapers, they recruited people via Instagram, there was some romance fraud there as well, and they essentially got people to purchase expensive products, generally with mainly laptops and coins, products that are very easily resellable. And what they did was they said, we want to order these products, but this company won't ship to our home. Can you order it for us? We'll give you a label, a UPS label, and you'll go to your local UPS store and then ship it to us. So, here's a way to make a quick couple $100. So they said sure. Some of them said sure. And then what the ring did is they said, okay, we just want to make sure, we want to mail you a check. What's your address? So they got the address. They went to Capital One. They had a bunch of stolen cards, and they got the billing address changed on the card to that of the fraud mule. So what happened was the billing address was the match when the transaction came through. It was being shipped to the address on the order. Everything else matched up, meaning the phone number and the email address linked back up, so it looked like a perfect order. And it was, these were definitely fraudulent. So the fraudsters are definitely getting smarter. So to that point. Now back to answer your original question of how companies can stop fraud. Many of them, like I said, will Google. Then they realize, this is too labor intensive. There must be a better way. So some of them will turn to some of the gateway filters that their gateway will offer. So these are very one-dimensional type of filters. If the billing address is not a match, then just cancel the order or put it under review. If it's I only want to accept transactions where it's at least a zip code match. But what ends up happening though is that there's a lot of transactions that will get caught in these filters that are actually legitimate. Our research has shown that about 90% of transactions that have the wrong billing address are actually safe to ship. So those are fraught with problems when they use the payment gateway filters.
Shoshana, just a great example that I saw firsthand was a merchant who was shipping wine. across the United States, so this was something. Basically, the people, you need an adult who has to be over 21 to sign. So they were sending it to their business address, which was not their home address. So it was a different zip code. That didn't work.
Right. Yeah, that's a great example. But once companies grow, a lot of them realize that it takes a lot of time to be able to screen orders manually. It also takes a lot of expertise, meaning you have to really know what you're doing. For example, this fraud pattern, we were able to see it because we have data from thousands of merchants. So we were able to pick up on that pattern. An individual doing it on their own would say, well, this looks good, with billing and shipping match, ABS positive. So a lot of companies realize it's just not worth it to do it on their own. And what they'll do is they'll use solutions like NoFraud, where it's fully automated. NoFraud will tell you pass, fail. If there's a review necessary, there's a continuum of risk. So those that fall kind of in the middle, NoFraud will review on their behalf. And they have that confidence knowing that if NoFraud missed a transaction and it resulted in a fraud chargeback, NoFraud will pay you back. And the beauty for CardKnox customers is that NoFraud's built right into CardKnox. So from an integration perspective, it's so easy. And we've had a really positive reaction to the integration that we've created with CardKnox.
Shoshana, that's very exciting. So maybe just to explain, to give a little more background into just an example that you gave. So basically, while merchants could spend their time Googling a full-time job and try to understand the intricacies and nuances of your business and the area that you and your team have such expertise in, it's like if there's a shortage on toilet paper, I'm not going to go make my own toilet paper. I mean, I could, cut down some trees and try to make it into toilet paper, but obviously purchasing it or outsourcing it essentially to those who make toilet paper best is definitely the easiest way to go, except in a pandemic. Then you go to Costco. So you mentioned that CardKnox has a native integration with NoFraud. There's one of the things that we have is we do have gateway filters. We do have a manual review. Okay, and you talked about that there's different options within the NoFraud platform of a full service option, just a scaled down variety of options that merchants can choose to shift that liability to you, or merchants can choose to accept the liability themselves. So basically leveraging the tools that you provide versus the full service option where you're guaranteeing transactions in the event of fraud. So before we wrap up, I know that my friend Yoel has some questions. Just a couple of cases where the site got hacked, credit card data is being compromised, and basically just leveraging credit card data. Shoshana, do you want to talk to that, or do you want me to speak about some of the things that we do in terms of securing data?
I mean, I'll say the part that I think that we've seen. When there is a data breach, it hurts everybody. Aside from the fact that customers may lose trust in the business, and if they're able to trace it back to the company where they had the data breach. I mean, I'm sure Target didn't do very well when it became public that there was a huge data breach. Same with the Starwood. I mean, there have been so many public ones. So aside from damage of brand reputation, the data is going somewhere. It's going into the wrong hands, and it ends up being packaged and resold on the dark web. And some of that credit card data may end up on your store as a fraud attempt. So that's why, while keeping PCI tight and making sure there are no data breaches affects, you would think, it just affects the cardholder, but at the end of the day, the whole e-commerce ecosystem is vulnerable every time there's a new data breach.
Understood. So we definitely saw many brands take a hit as a result of fraud. My own personal experience, my favorite experience, actually wasn't my favorite, but it was definitely one that was poignant for me, was when my wife purchased a sandwich in Uruguay, and we were home. So last I checked, she definitely was not purchasing any sandwiches in any restaurants, and they subsequently used that same credit card. They made a small purchase, like $8 for a sandwich, and then subsequently used it for a couple $1,000 Aero-Mexico ticket, which luckily I was able to stop. But so fraud definitely impacts all of us. Just Yoel, in terms of your question as far as websites and web security, so definitely you want to make sure that any card data. We talked about tokenization. You need to make sure it's encrypted properly, PCI compliance. So that's something where CardKnox comes in as one of the leaders in, with leveraging PCI compliance, making sure that it's part and parcel of the payment gateway, and making sure it's part and parcel of our platform. And then the other point is like this: you can't predict everything that's going to happen. Ultimately, if a credit card is stolen from a website that's not using CardKnox, right, that means that there is vulnerability, and you're going to have to use the service Shoshana brings to the table of NoFraud, and or risk losing that money, because someone else's website may not have the security that CardKnox has. Their data can be hacked. And the next thing you know is some guy in Minnesota is buying themselves a $300 Gucci bag. Anyway, do we have any other questions? I know there's been some polls that have been in progress. I know there's been some questions that have been asked. Is there any other questions that we haven't answered? Anything else that we can share from a fraud standpoint with our participants? Okay, so it looks like everyone's asking all at once, but I'm not sure we can deal with the deluge of all those questions. So it looks like Shoshana, we've done a really good job you've done a really good job of answering all the questions, explaining how fraud works and how an integrated or how NoFraud works, and how you protect people from fraud in an e-commerce platform, and the benefits of an integrated solution between CardKnox and NoFraud. I thank everyone for joining us, and Shoshana, thank you so much for being our guest this week.
My pleasure.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the week. Stay safe. Take care.
Take care.